Hi everyone. In this video we're going to talk about what is justice within political philosophy. In particular, we'll be discussing the question, what is distributive justice? What is the correct way to distribute the goods that society makes? In this video we'll look at our first two theories of egalitarianism and Rawls' take on distributive justice. In our next video we'll look at three other theories in addition to these two. Let's go ahead and get started. So this question of what is justice is as old as philosophy, and I figured we start with this meme here of, what is justice? Well, philosophers have been concerned with this for a very long time, going back to some of the earliest writings of philosophy from Plato, Aristotle. They all had questions about this. In fact, Plato's Republic is in large part a huge work just trying to answer this particular question. We're going to narrow that question down to distributive justice. So as noted, distributive justice is concerned with how benefits of a group should be distributed among its members. So one of the many goods in society that our society creates is wealth, monetary value. That's what we'll focus on, but we should note that's not the only thing that matters in terms of distributive justice. There's a range of applications here from micro to small, just even thinking about in a classroom setting or a small group setting, what's the just distribution of work? But then for the most part, we're going to be looking at the macro setting of nations as a whole. The first theory of justice here that we'll talk about is egalitarianism. So this one's fairly simple. It's simply justice as equality. Something that we'll note about egalitarianism and all the other theories that we look at in this video and the next one, there are a lot of different ways that these terms can be used. These are just names that our author Velasquez associates with these particular theories as pertaining to distributive justice. There are different contexts which egalitarianism, for example, are used in outside of this particular narrow sense. But in terms of distributive justice, egalitarianism means to simply giving an equal portion to everybody, that there's no relevant differences among people that can justify unequal treatment. Think of claims such as all people are created equal. Well, if that's the case, very strict egalitarians will say that, well, every person then should be given exactly the same amount as everybody else. So the poorest should have the exact same percentage as the richest. So one thing we can talk about here is what is the actual distribution of wealth in the United States? Clearly, distribution of wealth is never exactly equal. And of course, it's not even close to equal in the United States. In fact, it looks something more like this. Now, these are somewhat outdated numbers from a study back in 2011. For most estimates have this more skewed to the left in the sense that the lowest 20% have less and the top 20% have more today. You can also overlay here how much the top 1% has. The top 1% has by far more than the top 80%, and in fact has more than the top 90% combined. Once again, that 1% actually we can move it further over if we looked at estimates for 2020. We have another graph here, a bit more updated, and this just shows you a graph in terms of, so over here on the left side, we have percentage total of household wealth. The bottom 90% has around, well, anywhere from 25 to 30% of the total wealth, whereas the top 1% has anywhere from 35% to 40% of the total wealth in the United States. In fact, the top 0.1% has almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. So clearly, we're not anywhere close to equal in the United States in terms of distribution of wealth. Another way that we can look at this is look at the evolution of CEO pay versus the average worker in the United States. So back in 1965, the average CEO pay was roughly 20 times the amount of the average worker. If we go ahead to 1989, the average CEO pay is now 58 times that of the average worker. Now jump to 2017, just a few years ago, CEO pay is now over 300 times the pay of the average worker in the United States. So let's be clear, most individuals don't believe in egalitarianism for one reason or another. In fact, that's what we'll see with these 4 other theories that we'll talk about in this class, is that none of them think that we should have an equal distribution of wealth. They all have various reasons for why distribution of wealth should be unequal, but there is this question of, is the inequality that we see in the United States, and which is also somewhat reflected around the world as well, is that level of inequality justified? Is the current wealth distribution in the United States just? Is the current distribution even within United States companies, is that just? So let's take a look at another theory. So this is not egalitarianism. This is what you can call a Rawlsian theory of justice, because it was created by John Rawls. John Rawls' basic idea here is that justice is fairness. And now what's interesting here is that Rawls, he says justice is fairness, but fairness isn't always going to be an equal cut. We'll see how that plays out here in a little bit. So the question that he's considering here is, creating a just society means creating a fair society, but how do we determine what's fair? If we're going to say justice is fairness, what exactly does that mean? Well, he uses this thought experiment to help clarify this, and it's sometimes called the original position. The original position states, it asks, what rules of society would we agree to if we did not know what position we would be beforehand? This is sometimes described as the veil of ignorance. So in the veil of ignorance, we should imagine that we would not know anything about ourselves that could lead to prejudice. For example, we wouldn't know how wealthy we would be. We don't know what our social status we're going to be born into. We don't know our sex, our religion, our race, nationality, or even our natural abilities that we're going to be born with. Once we would know perhaps general scientific facts about the world and general theories, such as what we know about biology and human nature and psychology, and we even would know historical facts as well. So we have access to a library of scientific information, but we don't know anything about ourselves individually. So the question is, what rules would we agree to under those conditions? That once you set us a list of rules, say these are the rules that we're going to govern ourselves by, once you wake up, you could be anyone within that particular society. So if we want to create a fair society, Rawls thinks that we should consider this veil of ignorance. That way we're not going to make any rules that are just selfishly motivated for you only. We would only consider rules that's going to be fair for everybody. So based upon the veil of ignorance, this original position, John Rawls comes up with, he says 2 principles of justice, but they're kind of more like 2.5, but we'll talk about that later. The first principle has to deal with equal liberties. The first thing that he thinks that we'll agree to is that we would require equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties. So examples would be the general rights that we're used to today. And he says this thought experiment gives us justification for things like the Bill of Rights, things like human rights. So examples would be political liberty, free speech, right to assemble. All of those, the general rights that we're used to. So equality of rights cannot be sacrificed in the name of increasing social and economic goods, in his view. He says we're not going to be okay with saying, oh, this certain segment of society, we can enslave them because of their race, because of their religion, or what have you, because you wouldn't be okay with that because you don't know if you're going to wake up as a member of that portion of society, as a slave. So you think at the bare minimum, under the veil of ignorance, everybody's going to agree to a certain set of basic liberties that we're not going to be willing to sacrifice. So that's the first principle. Fairly straightforward. It's the second principle that gets a little bit more complicated. The second principle in his theory deals with conditions of inequality. So going back real quick to that first principle, you might be tempted to say, all right, well then doesn't this just justify egalitarianism, right? That everybody's just only going to be okay with everybody getting exactly the equal share, no inequality at all? He doesn't think so. As well, sure, we'll have an egalitarian in terms of rights, of basic rights, but not in the terms of distribution of goods. He does think that that inequality is going to be required, and we would agree to a certain amount of inequality. That's what the second principle is dealing with. What are these conditions of inequality? So the first condition is what we can call fair and equal opportunity. If we're going to allow for inequality in a system where some people have higher statuses, some people have more wealth, and so on, you would only agree to that if, when you wake up in the society, you will have a fair and equal opportunity to obtain those higher positions, whether or not you were born with those in those areas of society or not. So higher status must be open to all. Given similar abilities and motivations, people should have similar life chances of obtaining higher statuses. So something we should note here, though, is that if we are committed to this idea of fair and equal opportunity, Rawls thinks that that's going to require a few things at bare minimum. It would require equal educational opportunities. If some people are going to be able to get better educations because they were born into a wealthier family or born in a different zip code than somebody else, that's going to result in that person having a better opportunity at those higher statuses than someone else. And you're not going to be okay with that because you could be born in those underprivileged areas and not have access then to those higher statuses. So he thinks that's going to require equal educational opportunities, which isn't entirely controversial. That's why in the United States and many other countries that education is, or equal access to education is required, and that there's public schools and so on. He also thinks that this will put a cap at a certain level of wealth, because if we have extreme wealth, that means not only do we have unfair and equal opportunity, we can give anybody we want an unfair and unequal opportunity at higher statuses because we can, well, buy other people, buy other people's labor, buy other people's, education, and so on. He also thinks the prevention of extreme wealth, fairly controversial. The third one isn't that controversial either. Most people agree, and hopefully should agree, that we should prevent discrimination. And so things like racism, denying people work based off of race or sex or religion, those things aren't going to be okay either, because once again, affects fair and equal opportunity. All right, so that's condition one of what conditions need to be met to allow inequality, fair and equal opportunity. The second condition is that of what he calls the difference principle, which gets a little confusing because the difference principle is the second part of the second principle. So that's why I call it 2.5 principles of justice, but he calls it 2 principles of justice, so we'll stick to his wording. So the second condition for inequality is what he calls a difference principle. We'll define it here in a moment, but first I want to give an example. So imagine that two friends, Bob and Bill, they are choosing what movie theater they want to go to. And imagine there's 3 different movie theaters. They're all equal in terms of the type of theater it is, type of seating, and amenities around it. Everything, all things being equal, the only difference is driving time for each friend. So they're trying to determine which movie theater to go to, and they notice the first movie theater is complete equality. It's the exact same driving for a distance for both of them. It's 40 minutes each. However, Bill brings up another movie theater. So this other movie theater turns out to be closer for both of them. So it's not equal driving distance anymore, but it's better off for both of them because, well, it's less driving time for Bob and for Bill. Now imagine there's a third movie theater as well. Maybe Bill points out this one, you know what, actually there's one only 5 minutes away from me. Okay, it's 15-minute drive for you, but why don't we just do this one because, hey, it benefits me the most. Well, which one of these would be the fair option? So this is a clear example of what Rawls means by fairness, because for Rawls, fairness doesn't always mean equality. Theater 1 has the equal driving distance, but he thinks that the actually most fair option and the most rational option to pick, and I think most people would agree here, is Theater 2. So Theater 2, it doesn't have such an unequal driving distance between Bill and Bob, such as Theater 3, where Bob has to drive 10 times as long. So Theater 2 is prioritized, is better, rationally speaking, than Theater 3 thinks. Theater 2 is also better than Theater 1, because although it doesn't have the exact same driving distance for each, it's better off for both of them. It's a win-win situation. So Theater 2 is the rational one you should take, and he thinks it's the fairest option to take. It'd be irrational for Bob to say, no, we have to go to Theater 1 because it has the exact same driving distance. That'd be irrational because, well, it's better for both of them to do Theater 2. It'd also be irrational for Bill to insist on Theater 3 because, once again, it's demanding Bob to take 10 times the amount of driving times when they have these other available options to them. So how does this relate to the difference principle? Well, the difference principle is basically just that inequalities must benefit everyone, especially the least advantaged. So Theater 2 was a situation where we chose inequality over equality because it benefited everybody involved. Theater 3 didn't do that. So this is sometimes called a maxi-min approach, where you're maximizing the minimum outcome. Society should be focused on benefiting the least advantaged, the lowest class, the poor, or the disadvantaged, however you want to call that. So the idea here is, how do you test whether the difference principle is being applied? Ask whether this inequality that you're suggesting is beneficial for everyone. And if you really want to test that, look at the poorest of society. Are they better off because of this inequality than they would be otherwise? That's how you would agree to it under the veil of ignorance. We could say, well, yeah, this system has inequality, but you know what? Even if I wake up as the least advantaged group, I'm better off in this system of inequality than I would otherwise. So the basic idea here, it's not just inequality is just okay. It's okay when it benefits the poorest of society. So in an egalitarian society, everybody's the poorest, everybody's the richest. We would introduce inequality there if it makes the poorest member actually better than they would be otherwise. And that's the basic argument for inequality of the capitalist system we have today, and say, you know, if we just distributed everything equally, we wouldn't have the society that we have. But it doesn't justify just simply inequality always. The rich should not get richer at the expense of the poor. It's getting a system of inequality is only justified if it's in fact benefiting the poor. So to give you another example here, this is from a philosopher named Leif Venar, and he says, to illustrate, consider 4 hypothetical economic structures. These, so we have A, B, C, and D. There we go. It says here the difference principle selects C. Why? Well, if you look at C, it's the one that maximizes the minimum outcome. So if you look at the least advantaged group here, they are best off in this situation. So it's not a utilitarian scenario, because utilitarian would say do the option that benefits has the most benefits overall? Well, the most benefits overall would be option D here. But the difference principle instead would say, well, the problem with option D is that we arrive at option D at the expense of the poor. The poor are worse off here than they would be otherwise. And so we wouldn't agree to that under the veil of ignorance, because we would potentially be those least advantaged group that would have to sacrifice for the sake of, well, in this case, primarily the most advantaged group. So the difference principle is always going to try to maximize the least advantaged group. We're maximizing the minimum outcome here. All right, so in summary, we have the first principle that focuses on equal liberties, and then we have that second principle, which has two parts of it. The second principle details what are the conditions of inequality. Inequality is okay as long as that inequality has fair and equal opportunity of those higher statuses, and that we incorporate the difference principle, where we're trying to minimize or maximize rather that minimum outcome, that we are justifying this inequality because it benefits everybody, with special emphasis on the poorest of society. So a short quote from Rawls here, he states that injustice then is simply inequalities that are not to the benefit of all. All right, so we've looked at the egalitarian approach, where you distribute everything equally to everyone. And we spent a lot of time on the Rawls approach, which is the most complicated of these five, where he talks about distributing by equal liberty, by equal opportunity, and needs of the disadvantaged. Next time, we'll look at these other three cases, the other theories of distributive justice: libertarianism, socialism, and capitalism. We'll discuss what Pope Francis has to say on this topic and try to situate him within these five main theories. Well, that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.